Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly back into the shadows of human prehistory, where your dinner menu is basically whatever you can catch, dig up, or crack open. You crouch low by a flickering campfire, embers crackling and smoke clinging to your hair, gnawing on something halfway between charred and undercooked. No spoons, no napkins, just your hands and teeth. Your stomach growls in sympathy, but let's be honest, you probably won't survive this particular dining experience without at least one unfortunate case of food poisoning. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from and what time is it right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first bites of history are as much about necessity as they are about flavor. You imagine yourself tens of thousands of years ago, crouched in tall grass with a sharpened stick, waiting for a rabbit to dart by. When it does, you spring, and if you're lucky, tonight's protein is hopping straight into your cooking pot. Well, okay, more like straight into your fire pit. Meat back then was rarely tender, it was lean, tough, and chewed like old leather. But after a day of chasing it across open plains, that bite must have tasted like victory itself. Still, hunting wasn't your only option. You'd also be on your knees prying roots from the soil, popping tart berries into your mouth, or cracking nuts with a rock. It's not glamorous, but at least the nuts don't run away screaming. Historians still argue whether early humans leaned more heavily on hunting or gathering, but most agree your survival depended on whatever the land happened to give you in that season. Imagine the smell: wood smoke from the fire, the faint sweetness of roasting tubers, maybe even the sharp tang of wild onions tossed onto hot stones. It's not five-star dining, but your senses are alive in a way that modern takeout just doesn't deliver. As society shifted from roaming bands to settled villages, your plate, well, more like your flat rock, started to look a little different. Around 10,000 years ago, humans stumbled upon something revolutionary: farming. Instead of chasing food, you could coax it out of the soil. Suddenly, you're standing in a patch of wheat, watching those golden heads ripple in the breeze, and realizing bread is basically the world's first edible technology. Grind the grains, add water, slap the paste onto a hot rock, and voila, flatbread. The crunch is uneven, the taste earthy, but for the first time, you don't have to sprint to catch your dinner. And then comes the first great love affair: beer. Yep, in those same wheat fields, some clever ancestor discovered that leaving grain porridge to sit around could turn into something fizzy, tangy, and just strong enough to make you forget the hard day's work. Anthropologists even joke that beer might be the real reason farming took off, because if you can brew, you can settle down. Now that's motivation. But life isn't all barley and bubbles. Picture the clay pots you'd use to cook, clunky, heavy, but magical in their ability to hold water over fire. Suddenly, stews are on the menu. Toss in roots, herbs, and a chunk of meat if you're lucky, and you've invented comfort food. The steam rises, the flavors meld, and you don't have to risk burning half your face by biting into raw meat anymore. Of course, the quirky side of early eating is just as fascinating. Archaeologists have found evidence that some prehistoric folks used crocodile dung mixed with other ingredients as a sort of medicinal food or even cosmetic. So yeah, if you thought trendy detox smoothies were weird, our ancestors have you beat by a mile. And let's not even get started on the bugs. Crunchy beetles, wriggling larvae, roasted grasshoppers. You'd better hope you're not squeamish, because these protein-packed snacks were a staple in many early diets. Honestly, some modern chefs are circling back to this, calling it sustainable protein. You can just call it, no thanks. Still, with every bite, you're shaping the future of civilization. The act of sharing food becomes the glue holding your tribe together. Imagine the circle of firelight, shadows dancing on cave walls, everyone tearing into the same roasted haunch of meat. It's messy, primal, but also deeply communal. You're not just feeding your body, you're feeding your place in the group. And let's not forget the debates that swirl even today. Did humans first cook with controlled fire 1 million years ago, or was it closer to 400,000? Historians still argue whether early fire use was intentional or just lucky accidents. Either way, your roasted rabbit tastes way better than raw, and it probably saved you from a few nasty parasites. That alone is worth the smoky aftertaste. Every bite you take carries you forward, step by step, toward the great civilizations yet to come. Soon, your meals will be more than just survival. They'll be symbols of wealth, status, and culture. But for now, you sit back on your heels, lick soot from your fingers, and smile at the thought that maybe, just maybe, this crunchy, smoky, slightly charred hunk of root vegetable is the first comfort food in human history. The night stretches long, your fire crackles, and your belly is, finally, quiet. Tomorrow you'll plant seeds. Tomorrow you'll stumble into farming. And with farming you'll stumble into everything else that makes a civilization tick. But tonight, you sleep with the taste of wood smoke still clinging to your teeth, dreaming of what meals might come next. Morning breaks in your little farming village and you're already up before the sun. The rooster hasn't even bothered to crow yet, but the grindstone is waiting. You drop handfuls of dried wheat into a heavy stone mortar and begin the endless rhythm. Crush, grind, sift. Flour dust clings to your skin and the smell is nutty, raw, earthy. It's not glamorous work, but when you mix that powder with water and bake it on a clay slab, you're not just making food, you're inventing civilization. Bread is your anchor. It's portable, filling, and can last a few days before mold creeps in. In Mesopotamia, the so-called cradle of civilization, bread became so vital that workers were often paid in loaves. Imagine laboring all day to dig irrigation canals and your salary being a basket of flatbread and a jug of beer. Not cash, not coins, carbs. Honestly, that sounds like some people's dream job. And speaking of beer, let's not downplay its importance. Early Sumerians and Egyptians considered it a gift from the gods. Thick, porridge-like, and sipped through long straws to filter out the grain husks, beer wasn't just a drink, it was liquid nutrition. Safer than water, filling enough to count as a meal, and just intoxicating enough to make those back-breaking farming days more bearable. There's even evidence of workers building the pyramids being fueled by daily rations of beer. Picture that, sweating under the desert sun, hauling massive stones, and rewarding yourself with a frothy, slightly sour gulp of ancient brew. Hydration, calories, and morale boost all in one. Your diet is expanding now. Lentils, chickpeas, onions, and garlic simmer slowly in clay pots. Dates sweeten the edges of your palate. Olive oil becomes liquid gold, drizzled on bread or used as fuel for lamps. Fish pulled fresh from rivers glisten in the morning light, then roast gently over fires. Compared to your hunter-gatherer ancestors, you're practically living in a gourmet paradise. But here's the twist, your meals aren't just about survival anymore. They're about status. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, the rich feast on tender cuts of meat, honey-drizzled cakes, and exotic spices brought in from distant lands. Meanwhile, the poor scrape by on barley bread, lentil stew, and maybe a small onion or two. The table becomes a mirror of society itself. What you eat tells the world exactly where you stand. The Egyptians in particular, loved to celebrate food in art. Tomb paintings show baskets overflowing with figs, grapes, pomegranates, and bread loaves stacked high. Even in death, pharaohs demanded to be buried with food for the afterlife. Imagine stepping into eternity with a lunchbox packed with dates and honey cakes, ancient meal prep at its finest. And then there's the sheer ingenuity of preservation. Salt becomes your refrigerator. Drying, smoking, and fermenting keep fish and meat edible long past their natural expiration date. Cheese enters the scene likely by accident, milk stored in animal stomach pouches curdling into something tangy, crumbly, and surprisingly delicious. One mistake, one curious taste test, and boom, humanity invents dairy. But not everything on your plate is delicious. Some experiments go terribly wrong. In ancient China, delicacies included fermented beans so pungent they could clear an entire house. In early Rome, garum, a fermented fish sauce, was poured on nearly everything from bread to fruit. Imagine opening a jar of fish guts left in the sun for weeks and thinking, yes, this will make my dinner better. To be fair, it was wildly popular, proving once again that taste is all about culture. Food isn't just eaten, it's shared, traded, and fought over. The spice trade, stretching from India to the Mediterranean, becomes one of history's great engines of connection. Cinnamon, pepper, cloves, and nutmeg cross deserts and seas, worth their weight in gold. Wars are fought over salt, taxes are levied on pepper, and entire empires rise and fall on who controls the spice routes. The simple act of seasoning your stew is suddenly tied to global politics. Now, close your eyes and picture yourself sitting cross-legged in a bustling marketplace of Babylon or Thebes. The air is thick with smoke, roasting lamb, the sweetness of figs, and the sharp tang of garlic. Merchants shout over each other, bargaining in half a dozen languages. Children dart through the crowd, clutching sticky dates. Somewhere, a priest chants over a sacrificial fire, smoke curling skyward with the smell of charred meat. You reach for a clay bowl of lentil stew, hot and hearty, and wash it down with a gulp of beer thick enough to chew. This isn't just eating, it's culture in action. Food is shaping belief systems, economic systems, and social hierarchies. It's fuel, ritual, and identity, all in one bite. And yet, beneath all the noise and richness, the same truth remains. Every meal still depends on the land, the weather, and sheer luck. A bad flood, a locust swarm, a poor harvest, and your belly growls again. Civilization may be advancing, but hunger is always one bad season away. Tomorrow we'll step deeper into history, where banquets become theater, where emperors eat like gods, and where the poor survive on scraps. But for tonight, let the smoky scent of bread and stew lull you into a kind of ancient comfort. You've survived another day, and for now that's enough. By the time we reach ancient Greece and Rome, food has evolved into something far bigger than survival. It's performance, politics, and power. Step into an Athenian symposium. The word itself means drinking together, but it's not just about wine, it's about ideas. Men recline on couches, sipping watered-down wine from shallow cups. Slaves move quietly through the room, pouring refills and laying out trays of olives, figs, roasted chickpeas, and honey cakes. The food isn't the star here, it's the conversation. Philosophy, poetry, politics. Plato himself might be in the corner, arguing about justice while nibbling on grapes. Imagine debating the meaning of life with your mouth full of cheese and bread. That's the Greek way. But travel west to Rome and dining becomes theater. The Romans perfected the banquet or convivium, and it wasn't just about eating, it was about showing off. Picture yourself entering a villa lit by flickering oil lamps, mosaics gleaming on the floor. The host greets you not with a handshake but with a promise. Tonight you'll feast like the gods. And what a feast it is. First, oysters, fresh from the coast, glistening with seawater. Then roasted dormice, stuffed with herbs and honey, a delicacy so prized it was written into Roman farming manuals. Platters of roasted boar arrive, its skin glistening, its belly filled with sausages. There's peacock with feathers still intact, flamingo tongues sautéed with spices, and fish served whole, eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Each course is more extravagant than the last, not because guests are hungry, but because the host wants to prove one thing. I am richer, more powerful, and more cultured than you. And then comes garum. This infamous fermented fish sauce was Rome's ketchup, drizzled on everything from meat to fruit. Factories along the Mediterranean coast churned out barrels of it, and the smell was so pungent that entire neighborhoods were avoided on production days. Yet in Rome, garum was liquid gold. To refuse it would be like rejecting salt or olive oil. It was a culinary necessity no matter how questionable the aroma. But let's pause here. Because while the elite reclined at banquets with peacock and wine, the poor of Rome ate something very different. Their staple? A kind of porridge called pulse, made from emmer wheat or barley boiled into a thick paste. Sometimes flavored with vegetables, sometimes with a splash of oil, often with nothing at all. Bread was common, but white bread was reserved for the wealthy. Most Romans chewed on coarse, dark loaves. Meat? Rare. Cheese and olives? Occasional treats. Street food kept the city alive. Picture walking down a crowded Roman alley. Smoke drifts from clay ovens, where bakers pull out round loaves stamped with marks to show who made them. Vendors sell fried fish, sausages, or chickpea pancakes to workers grabbing a quick bite. In fact, many Romans didn't even cook at home. Tiny apartments without kitchens made eating out a necessity. Taverns buzzed with chatter, laughter, and the clink of mugs filled with watered-down wine. Eating wasn't just about food, it was about community. And then there was the bread dole, a nona. Grain imported from Egypt was distributed by the state to keep citizens fed and, more importantly, loyal. Bread and circuses, as the poet Juvenal put it, give the people food and entertainment and they won't question power. Food, in this sense, was politics in its simplest form. Yet Rome's obsession with food also birthed the first real cookbooks. Apicius, a wealthy gourmand, left behind a collection of recipes that read like a mix of fine dining and mad science. Flamingo, stuffed sow's udders, and dishes spiced so heavily with pepper they must have burned the tongue. These recipes weren't about nutrition, they were about spectacle. To dine at Apicius's table was to witness art on a plate, however strange it tasted. But meals weren't just feasts of excess. They were rituals. Romans prayed before meals, offered portions to household gods, and even treated dinner as a way to bond families together. Reclining on couches, passing dishes around, laughing, arguing, it wasn't so different from a modern dinner party. Only instead of wine glasses, you might be sipping from a silver cup etched with scenes of Hercules wrestling lions. The contrast is striking. Peasants scraping bowls of porridge in dim, smoky taverns, while senators gorged themselves on exotic meats beneath painted ceilings. Two versions of Rome, both bound together by the same truth. Without food, civilization crumbles. And so, as night falls over the empire, you're left with two choices. Do you want to sit in the shadows of a noisy street market, tearing bread with calloused hands? Or do you recline in marble halls, peacock feathers brushing your face as a slave pours your wine? Either way, what you eat, and how you eat it, defines exactly who you are in this world. Step into medieval Europe, and the dinner table tells you everything you need to know about life in the so-called Dark Ages. At the top of the chain are the lords and nobles. Their meals are spectacles, part nourishment, part theater, and part politics. Imagine a great hall lit by flickering torches, tapestries draped across stone walls, long wooden tables covered with trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread that act as edible plates. The air is thick with the smell of roasting meat, spiced pies, and the sharp tang of ale. Music plays in the background, minstrels strumming lutes while servants hurry back and forth carrying heavy platters. A roasted swan, its feathers carefully reattached after cooking for decoration, might be the centerpiece. A whole boar, its mouth stuffed with an apple, is wheeled into gasps of admiration. Dishes arrive in waves: venison stews, rabbit pies, pheasants, eels, and thick loaves of bread. For dessert, spiced wine, honey cakes, and candied fruits imported at great expense from faraway lands. But food is never just food here, it's status. Spices like cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and pepper are worth their weight in gold. To sprinkle them on your meal is to announce your wealth as loudly as a crown. A poor peasant might never even smell cinnamon in their lifetime, but at a noble's feast, it coats the air with exotic luxury. Now step outside that hall and into the life of a peasant. The contrast could not be sharper. For most people, the diet is monotonous, filling, and, by modern standards, painfully bland. Bread is the staple, made from rye, barley, or oats, sometimes mixed with peas or beans to stretch it further. Porridge and pottage, thick stews of grains boiled with whatever vegetables were on hand, fill the stomach day after day. Meat? Rare. Maybe a bit of salted pork or a rabbit caught in the woods, if fortune smiled. Otherwise, meals leaned heavily on cabbage, onions, turnips, and beans. Dairy products, milk, butter, cheese, added some protein, but in times of poor harvest even those were luxuries. Hunger was never far away, and in years of famine, survival meant stretching bread with sawdust or moss. And here's where things get stranger. Medicine and food often blurred together. If you were sick, you didn't go to a doctor. Doctors were few, expensive, and often relied on treatments we'd call bizarre today. Instead, food became cure. Have a fever? Drink a broth of boiled herbs. Stomach troubles? A potion of wine mixed with ground pearls or powdered antlers. Toothache? Try rubbing roasted onions on your gums. Bloodletting was another common cure. Physicians believed illness came from an imbalance of the body's four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. So, if you had a headache or fever, they might drain your blood with leeches, or worse, cut into your veins. Imagine sitting at a table, weak from illness, while someone insists that bleeding you out will restore balance. And food taboos shaped life too. The church imposed fasting days, sometimes half the year, when meat and dairy were forbidden. Fish became the substitute, but inland peasants often had little access. Instead, they relied on salted or dried fish, tough and unappetizing. To break the fast and sneak meat could mean punishment not just from the church but from your community. Hygiene around food was another story. In noble halls, trenchers of bread soaked up greasy meat juices, then were tossed to servants or the poor. Cutlery was rare. People ate with knives in their fingers, wiping hands on tablecloths or even their dogs. Ale and weak beer were safer to drink than water, since wells and rivers were often contaminated. For children, this meant growing up sipping watered-down ale with their bread and pottage. Yet even in these harsh conditions there was joy. Fairs and festivals meant roasted meats, spiced cakes, and barrels of ale shared among neighbors. Harvest feasts turned the year's hard work into celebration, with music, dancing, and rare indulgences. In those moments, food wasn't just survival, it was community, laughter, and warmth against the darkness. The Middle Ages remind us of a simple truth. Meals reveal the divide between rich and poor more than almost anything else. For nobles, food was a stage on which wealth and power were performed. For peasants, it was a daily battle against hunger where bread and stew kept you alive but just barely. And perhaps the strangest part? If you were a time traveler dropped into a medieval banquet, you might find the food overwhelming, overspiced, overly sweet, sometimes cooked until unrecognizable. But to the people of the time, this was life, this was luxury, and this was survival. Now let's cross the cold seas to the Viking world. Forget the images of endless feasting from TV shows. Real Viking meals were practical, rugged, and built around survival. A Viking day began with a simple breakfast called dagmo, usually bread, dried fish, or porridge made from barley or oats, washed down with ale or buttermilk. Vikings drank ale like water, not because they were drunk all day, but because it was safer than contaminated river water. Even children had weak beer with their meals. The heart of Viking cuisine was stews and soups, simmering for hours in a large iron cauldron hanging over the hearth. Into the pot went whatever was available: meat, fish, beans, onions, root vegetables, and lots of herbs. Bread was dense and hearty, often mixed with seeds or even tree bark when grain ran short. And while meat was highly prized, it wasn't eaten every day. Instead, fish, fresh, dried, or smoked, was a staple, especially for coastal communities. But Vikings were also skilled at preservation. They dried fish into stockfish, salted meats, and fermented vegetables, because in the brutal Nordic winters, survival depended on planning ahead. Imagine gnawing on a tough strip of dried cod or salted pork during a snowstorm, knowing that was your lifeline until spring. Still, they loved feasts. When chieftains or jarls wanted to show wealth, they slaughtered cattle, roasted lambs, brewed mead, and brought out massive drinking horns filled with ale or honey wine. Storytellers and skalds recited sagas while warriors boasted of battles. Feasts weren't just about food, they were about loyalty, power, and honor. Now, let's sail halfway across the world to feudal Japan, where the life of a samurai was disciplined and precise, even at the dining table. A samurai's daily meals were humble compared to their battlefield glory. Rice was the cornerstone of Japanese cuisine, served with pickled vegetables, miso soup, and small portions of fish or tofu. Meat was rare, partly due to Buddhist influence, which discouraged animal slaughter. Instead, soybeans provided protein, whether as tofu, miso, or soy sauce. For warriors, the food mirrored their philosophy: simple, balanced, and fueling discipline. Breakfast might be a bowl of rice with miso soup and pickles. Lunch and dinner followed the same pattern: small, nutritious portions meant to sustain rather than indulge. Unlike medieval European feasts, Japanese dining emphasized harmony and restraint. And yet, in castles and noble households, food could still be elaborate. Kaiseki-style dining, a refined, multi-course meal, emerged from the tea ceremony, showcasing delicate seasonal ingredients: grilled fish, simmered vegetables, sashimi, and rice presented with elegance. Each dish was not only nourishment but also art, arranged to reflect beauty and transience. Tea itself was central. Samurai embraced the shinoyu or tea ceremony, where powdered green tea matcha was whisked into a frothy bowl. This ritual wasn't just about drinking, it was about mindfulness, respect, and the calm before or after battle. A warrior could wield both sword and teacup with equal discipline. But not everything was refined. During military campaigns, samurai often survived on simple rations: rice balls, dried fish, or preserved plums, omebashi, easy to carry and long-lasting. Imagine a samurai sitting under a pine tree, armor beside him, biting into a salty rice ball before heading back to war. What's striking here is the contrast. Vikings ate to conquer hunger and withstand the harsh north. Their food was rugged, hearty, and communal, tied to survival and honor. Samurai, meanwhile, ate to balance body and spirit. Their meals reflected discipline, ritual, and a harmony between nourishment and philosophy. Two warrior cultures, worlds apart, yet both reveal a truth: food wasn't just fuel. It was a mirror of how they lived, fought, and believed. For the Viking, a feast was glory. For the samurai, a simple bowl of rice could be a meditation. Now let's cross the oceans and step into colonial America, where everyday meals were shaped by survival, scarcity, and the blending of cultures. For most settlers, breakfast wasn't bacon and eggs like we imagine today. Instead, it was much simpler: a bowl of porridge made from cornmeal, often called hasty pudding, bread dipped in milk, or leftover stew from the night before. If you were wealthy, you might have butter, cheese, or even tea imported from England. But for the average colonist, mornings were plain and practical. At midday, families gathered for dinner, the largest meal of the day. Picture a wooden table with salted pork, boiled vegetables, baked beans, cornbread, and maybe fish if you lived near rivers or the coast. Fresh meat was rare. Most protein came from salted, smoked, or dried provisions. Seasonal vegetables like turnips, squash, and beans filled the plates, and apples were everywhere, baked, stewed, or pressed into cider. Evenings brought supper, a lighter meal, often just bread and milk, or a repeat of earlier dishes. Nothing was wasted. Leftovers were reheated, bones became broth, and scraps fed livestock. In fact, efficiency was as important as taste, because every harvest and every hunt determined whether families survived harsh winters. What's fascinating is how Native American traditions shaped colonial diets. Corn, beans, and squash, known as the Three Sisters, were staples taught to settlers by indigenous peoples. Without this knowledge, many colonists simply wouldn't have survived. They also adopted methods like smoking fish, drying meat, and making cornbread. Colonial cooking was essentially a fusion. Old world techniques meeting new world ingredients. Still, class made a big difference. A wealthy landowner's table might include imported spices, sugar, molasses, or fine wine from Europe. Poorer families relied almost entirely on what they could grow, hunt, or barter for. And in cities like Boston or Philadelphia, bustling taverns became community centers where men drank ale, ate hearty stews, and exchanged news, often rowdy, smoky, and full of political debates. But life wasn't just about food, it was about ritual and meaning. Sunday dinners were special, often featuring roasted meat, pies, and cakes baked in brick ovens. These meals symbolized not only rest from labor but also faith, family, and resilience. And like the Vikings and samurai, colonists had their own drinks of choice. Water was often unsafe, so people drank cider, beer, or small beer, a weak ale suitable for children. In fact, cider was so common that some families made barrels of it every year, an apple-based lifeline through long winters. Colonial America teaches us something powerful. Food wasn't about luxury, it was about endurance. Every seed planted, every pig raised, every barrel of cider pressed meant the difference between hunger and survival. Meals reflected not just taste but community, hard work, and the blending of cultures that would shape an entire nation. Now the fire crackles lower, and you find yourself wandering through the dim stone corridors of medieval Europe, where meals might keep you alive, but medicine? Well, that's another story. Imagine you wake up one morning with a pounding headache. Today you'd grab an ibuprofen and a glass of water. Back then, a physician might suggest drilling a small hole in your skull to let the evil spirits escape. Yes, trepanation was practiced, and somehow, some patients actually survived. You're starting to see why I said you probably wouldn't last a day here. But food and medicine often overlapped. For example, garlic and onions weren't just for stews, they were thought to protect against plague. Honey doubled as a wound dressing, since it naturally resists bacteria, one of the few medieval remedies that modern science still agrees with. And wine wasn't just for toasts, it was often used as a disinfectant, though let's be honest, after a few cups you'd probably forget about the wound entirely. If your stomach ached, you might be handed a mixture of mint, fennel, or wormwood steeped in ale. For fever, doctors prescribed willow bark, which contains the same compound that later became aspirin. See, not everything was complete nonsense. But then you'd also encounter treatments like ground-up emeralds or powdered mummy dust, sold at markets as magical cures. Yes, actual mummified remains from Egypt were ground into powder and ingested, because why not swallow a dead pharaoh if it might fix your cough? Hospitals existed, but don't picture sterile wards. They were more like monasteries where monks cared for the sick with prayer, herbal concoctions, and sometimes bizarre rituals. One mainstream fact: bloodletting was considered the ultimate fix. Using leeches or knives, doctors believed draining blood would balance your humors. Did it work? Historians still argue whether some patients improved due to rest and diet, or whether it was just sheer luck. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some believed carrying a dried toad in your pocket could cure rheumatism. If that didn't work, you might try wearing charms, burning incense, or sleeping with herbs stuffed under your pillow. Basically, medicine often blurred into magic, faith, and superstition. Meanwhile, diet itself was seen as a kind of preventive medicine. Rich nobles indulged in heavy meats, sauces, and sweets, but doctors often warned them to balance it with lighter foods like fish, fruit, or vegetables. The poor, ironically, with their simpler diets of grains, beans, and cabbage, often ate more healthily by today's standards, though malnutrition and famine were constant threats. But perhaps the most terrifying cure came during outbreaks like the Black Death. People resorted to wild treatments, bathing in vinegar, inhaling crushed flowers, rubbing themselves with mercury, or even whipping their own backs in public as penance. Spoiler alert, none of it stopped the plague. And yet, amidst all this medieval madness, some wisdom survived. Herbal gardens and monasteries preserved ancient knowledge from Greece and Rome, keeping alive remedies we still recognize today. Chamomile tea to calm the stomach? Straight from those cloistered gardens. Lavender for sleep? Same roots. So here you are, wandering through a world where your dinner might be a bowl of pottage and your medicine might be, well, a leech, a toad, or powdered emeralds. Sleep tight knowing that at least tonight, you only need a blanket and a pillow, not a medieval barber surgeon with a sharp knife and some questionable ideas about your humors. You shuffle onward through the dreamscape, and suddenly the sound of rushing rivers surrounds you. The Tigris and the Euphrates spread wide beneath a golden sun, and there, in the bustling city-states of ancient Mesopotamia, banquets glitter like something pulled straight from a clay tablet. Tables groan under the weight of roasted meats, bowls of lentils, onions, dates, figs, cucumbers, and, most importantly, vast pitchers of beer. Yes, beer. Brewed from barley, thick and cloudy, drunk through straws so you wouldn't choke on floating husks. You'd be slurping alongside merchants, nobles, and priests alike, because in Mesopotamia, beer wasn't just a drink, it was a way of life. There are records of workers being paid in daily rations of it. Imagine clocking out of your shift today and getting a six-pack as your paycheck. Not the worst deal, honestly. Banquets here weren't just for eating, they were acts of social and political theater. Kings used food to flaunt their wealth, strengthen alliances, and honor the gods. You'd find entire roasted sheep, loaves of bread shaped with elaborate designs, and fruits imported from faraway lands. One mainstream fact: archaeologists uncovered lists of banquet provisions, including hundreds of sheep and goats slaughtered for a single royal feast. Try explaining that to your neighborhood butcher. And don't forget music, dancing, and poetry. Banquets were accompanied by lyres and drums, and sometimes by recitations of epic tales like Gilgamesh. You'd be sitting there, chewing on grilled lamb, nodding along to a bard telling the story of gods flooding the world because humans were too noisy. If you've ever had neighbors blasting music at 2 a.m., maybe you can sympathize with the gods' logic. Quirky tidbit? Banquet leftovers weren't just tossed in the garbage, they often ended up in rituals. Food scraps could be offered to household gods, buried for good luck, or given to temple priests as symbolic gifts. Nothing went to waste, except maybe your waistline. Of course, there's a darker side. These feasts often highlighted the inequality of Mesopotamian life. Nobles feasted lavishly, while the poor survived on basic bread, onions, and thin stews. Historians still argue whether communal beer drinking bridged social divides, or whether it just made the harsh lines between classes a little blurrier for an evening. And then there's the banquet etiquette. Picture this: you're seated with sticky fingers trying to eat politely. But utensils? Forget forks. His hands, bread as a scoop, and maybe knives for carving. Drinking beer from a straw? A little awkward, especially if the straw is 3 feet long and shared with everyone else at the table. It's communal sipping, Mesopotamian style. Sanitary? Not really. But hey, germs weren't exactly on the radar back then. What about sweets? Mesopotamians adored dates. They mashed them into cakes, mixed them with nuts, or boiled them into syrups. Combined with milk and honey, these sticky treats might have been the world's earliest desserts. Imagine trying to floss after that without dental care. Spoiler, you wouldn't. And the gods always had their share. Offerings of bread, meat, and beer were left at temples, because no banquet was truly complete without divine participation. In a way, you weren't just eating for yourself, you were eating as part of a cosmic contract. Keep the gods fed and happy, and maybe they'd spare you from floods or famine. Miss a few offerings though and well, don't expect much mercy. You can almost smell the roasting lamb, feel the thick barley beer on your tongue, and hear the clink of clay mugs as the evening darkens. Firelight dances on mud brick walls, and around you, men in woolen robes and women in embroidered gowns laugh, gossip, and strike deals that might change empires. You're just trying not to spill beer down your lap. And when the night finally winds down, you'd shuffle away from the banquet hall a little tipsy, sticky with honey, smelling faintly of lamb fat. Maybe you'd mutter a prayer to Ishtar or Ninkasi, the goddess of beer, thanking them for the feast. Just don't forget, you'll be back to onions and flatbread tomorrow. The banquets were grand, but daily life? That was far more humble. The dream carries you farther down the Nile, where the air is thick with the smell of baked bread and lotus blossoms drifting on the river. You arrive in ancient Egypt, a land where food was not only fuel but also a divine gift from the gods. And tonight, you've been invited to a banquet in the house of a wealthy noble. First, let's clear something up. The Egyptians loved their bread and beer. These two were the backbone of the diet, eaten daily by everyone from farmers to pharaohs. But don't imagine fluffy white baguettes. Egyptian bread was dense, often gritty with sand and stone fragments from the grinding process. Bite into it and you'd risk chipping a tooth. Dental problems? Practically guaranteed. Archaeologists studying mummies found worn-down teeth, cavities, and abscesses, all thanks to their daily dose of sandy bread. Delicious but dangerous. Beer, on the other hand, was thick, nutritious, and slightly sour. Think less lager at the pub, and more liquid porridge. It was drunk from tall clay jars, sometimes flavored with dates or honey. For Egyptians, beer was more than just a drink. It was a blessing from the gods, especially Hathor, the goddess of joy and drunkenness. Festivals dedicated to her often involved drinking until you passed out, waking up, and then drinking some more. Ancient hangovers were very much a thing. But tonight's banquet? This is no ordinary farmer's supper. The noble host has spared no expense. Servants bring platters piled high with roast goose, duck, beef, and lamb. Fish from the Nile glisten in baskets, seasoned with garlic, cumin, and coriander. Bowls of figs, dates, and grapes overflow, alongside jars of honey and trays of pastries shaped like animals and flowers. Sweet treats were a luxury, often reserved for the elite. And the wine. Imported from the Nile Delta and sometimes even from abroad, red and white wines were stored in amphorae sealed with clay stoppers. Only the rich could afford them. Tonight, you'd sip it from ornate cups while reclining on a cushioned chair, listening to harps and flutes filling the air with music. Banquets were more than meals, they were performances. Servants fanned guests, perfumed cones of scented fat were placed on your head, yes, actual cones that melted slowly, dripping fragrance down your hair and clothes, and dancers swayed in the lamplight. You'd be expected to clap in rhythm, sip, chew, and politely flatter your host. Awkward silences? Not allowed. Laughter and storytelling kept the atmosphere lively. And, of course, the Egyptians had their quirks. Some believed eating certain foods granted powers, like lettuce, which was associated with fertility. Honey wasn't just food, it doubled as medicine and even embalming material. Imagine being offered a honey cake and wondering if it came from the same jar used for treating a wound. The gods always had their share too. Before feasts, offerings of bread, beer, meat, and fruit were laid out for the deities in temples. Priests would feed the gods, and only afterward would the food be redistributed among the people. In a sense, every banquet was also a spiritual act, a reminder that abundance flowed from divine favor. But here's the catch. While nobles feasted like kings, the majority of Egyptians lived on far simpler meals. For common folk, daily fare meant bread, onions, garlic, beans, lentils, and maybe some dried fish if you were lucky. Banquets were a dazzling display of wealth, not a snapshot of everyday life. If you were a laborer building pyramids, your feast was more likely a double portion of beer and bread than roasted goose. Still, the experience of sitting under torchlight, eating roasted duck with honey glaze, sipping date wine, and laughing at a harpist's silly song would be unforgettable. You'd feel the warmth of the oil lamp flames, smell the perfume melting from the cone on your head, and hear the gentle splash of the Nile just outside. Until, of course, your stomach reminded you that maybe mixing beer, wine, honey cakes, and garlic-seasoned fish wasn't the smartest decision. Let's just say ancient Egyptian banquets may have ended with more than a few guests slipping away to pray to the porcelain god, if toilets had been invented yet. By the time you staggered home, sticky with honey and reeking of beer, you'd know one thing for sure. The Egyptians didn't just live for the afterlife. They knew how to enjoy the here and now too. The dream shifts again. You blink, and the golden sands of the Nile fade into marble columns, tiled courtyards, and the hum of Latin chatter. You've arrived in ancient Rome, just in time for a feast. And believe me, Roman banquets weren't simply about food. They were statements of power, theater, and sometimes pure excess. First things first, Roman dining wasn't like ours. Forget chairs and tables. At a proper banquet, you reclined on couches arranged in a U-shape around a low table. Men lounged on their sides, propped on one elbow, while servants hustled to bring in course after course. Eating while lying down wasn't laziness, it was a sign of status. If you were upright on a stool, sorry, you weren't elite enough. The food? Well, the food. Romans were notorious for their adventurous palates. At the humblest level, the poor survived on bread, porridge, olives, and cheap wine. But at the banquets of senators and emperors, the menu was designed to shock and impress. Think of it like reality TV, but with roasted flamingo tongues. Here's what you might see on the table. Dormice stuffed with minced pork and pine nuts, roasted until golden. Yes, mice. Romans bred them in special jars called gleraria. Ostrich, peacock, or parrot, because chicken was too ordinary. Peacock tongues were especially prized, not for taste but for prestige. Seafood platters with oysters, squid, and fish from as far away as Spain or Egypt, transported in tanks of salt water. Freshness mattered even if it meant insane cost. Exotic sauces, particularly garum, a fermented fish sauce so pungent it could knock you off your reclining couch. It was Rome's ketchup, splashed on everything from meats to fruits. But it wasn't all bizarre. Romans also loved figs, dates, cheeses, sausages, lentils, and honey cakes. They had a sweet tooth and adored mixing sweet and savory. A roast boar might be stuffed with figs and drenched in honey. Grapes and wine flowed endlessly. And speaking of wine, Romans never drank it straight. That was considered barbaric. Instead, they diluted it with water, sometimes adding herbs, honey, or even seawater for flavor. Banquets weren't just about eating, they were about display. Musicians played lyres, poets recited verses, and dancers entertained guests. Wealthy hosts staged elaborate courses designed to awe. Imagine a roasted pig being carried in, only to be sliced open at the table and dozens of live birds flying out in a burst of feathers. Yes, that really happened. Roman showmanship was unmatched. And yet, for all the glamour, there was also absurdity. Some elite Romans took pride in vomiting mid-feast so they could keep eating. The idea of a vomitorium as a special room is a myth, but the practice of purging to make room for more was real enough. Gluttony wrapped in a toga. Not everyone approved. Philosophers like Seneca criticized the waste and decadence of these feasts, pointing out that while nobles feasted on flamingo, ordinary citizens often went hungry. For the poor, daily meals were gruel, bread, and maybe a handful of olives. Their banquet was a warm bowl of lentils. Still, attending one of these elite gatherings would have been dazzling. Reclining in the flicker of oil lamps, sipping spiced wine, listening to poets recite tales of heroes while servants balanced silver platters of bizarre delicacies, it would be equal parts surreal and intoxicating. But here's the catch: survival might be tricky. Could your stomach handle dormouse stuffed with pork, fish sauce poured on honey cakes, and watered wine flavored with seawater? Probably not. Most modern travelers would end the night clutching their gut, regretting every bite. And yet, that was the Roman way: indulgence, spectacle, and excess. A banquet wasn't about nourishment. It was about showing the world you had conquered hunger, nature, and wealth itself. In Rome, you didn't just eat dinner. You performed it. By the time the dream fades, you might be grateful to leave behind the peacock tongues and fermented fish sauce. But one thing would linger. The Romans understood that food wasn't just food, it was identity, status, and sometimes absurd theater. The dream carries you forward again. The marble villas of Rome dissolve into drafty stone halls, the air thick with smoke from torches. You're in medieval Europe now, sitting at a long wooden table inside a great hall. The clatter of cups, the smell of roasting meat, and the murmur of voices remind you, you've arrived at a feast in the Middle Ages. But don't expect silver cutlery or sparkling crystal. Medieval dining had its own rules, some strange, some downright unsanitary. First, the seating arrangement. At the high table sat the lord and lady of the manor, their family, and honored guests. Everyone else, knights, clergy, servants, sat further down according to rank. Your position at the table was a visible measure of your importance. As for the plates, forget ceramic dishes. Diners ate off trenchers, flat rounds of stale bread, used as edible plates. Meat, stews, and sauces were piled on top. Once soaked through, the trencher could be eaten, given to the poor, or tossed to the dogs. Hygiene was not exactly the top priority. Cutlery? You'd better bring your own knife. Forks, though common in the Byzantine Empire, were considered scandalous and effeminate in much of medieval Europe until centuries later. So most guests tore food apart with their hands. Fingers slick with grease were wiped on the tablecloth, or more often, on whatever unlucky servant stood nearby holding a towel. Before the feast began, water basins were passed around for hand washing. But don't picture sparkling clean rituals. Guests often dipped their hands in the same bowl. Shared germs were part of the experience. Now the food itself. A noble's table might feature roasted venison, swan, or boar, proudly displayed whole, feathers or fur intact for drama. Pies stuffed with rabbits, birds, or even live animals that would leap out when cut open. Surprise entertainment. Stews of beef, mutton, or fish, heavily seasoned not just for taste but to disguise questionable freshness. Spices like cinnamon, cloves, and pepper were prized luxuries, shipped from Asia at great expense. Ale and mead flowed freely since water was often unsafe to drink. For peasants, meanwhile, meals were far humbler. Black bread made of rye, pottage, a thick stew of grains and vegetables, and maybe salted pork or herring on feast days. The gap between noble and commoner diets was vast. And the table manners? They would shock you. Guests often shared drinking cups, passing them down the table. Double dipping was the norm. Belching wasn't just tolerated, it could be considered a compliment to the cook. Some feasts were so rowdy that nights ended up brawling, swords drawn, right at the table. But it wasn't all chaos. There were strict codes of etiquette, especially in noble courts. For example, never lick your fingers noisily. Do not bite into food and then dip it back in the communal sauce. Always break bread for your neighbor as a gesture of goodwill. Entertainment was essential. Between courses, minstrels sang ballads, jesters cracked jokes, and sometimes trained animals performed tricks. Feasting was about spectacle as much as sustenance. Still, a medieval feast could be overwhelming. Imagine greasy trenchers, communal hand-washing, no forks, and flavors dominated by vinegar, honey, and overpowering spices. To modern taste buds, it would be both fascinating and bizarre. And for the poor? Their version of a banquet was a rare bowl of meat stew or a hunk of bread from the Lord's kitchen. The contrast between gilded halls and peasant huts was stark. If you, a traveler from today, found yourself seated at such a feast, you might struggle with the oil, the noise, and the lack of sanitation. But one thing is certain, you'd never forget it. In medieval Europe, a meal wasn't just food, it was a performance of hierarchy, tradition, and survival. By the time the dream drifts away, you'd be relieved to wash your hands in clean running water and eat with a fork. But for medieval lords and peasants alike, this was life, and it was as much about community as cuisine. You know a roasted boar with grease running down your chin, the fire crackling behind you, shadows stretching tall across timbered hall walls. It's a feast night in an ancient Celtic settlement, and the air feels thick with wood smoke, sweat, and the sharp tang of ale. Someone just smacked you on the back so hard your ribs are reconsidering their alignment, but you grin through it because apparently that's how friendship works here. The centerpiece is a massive spit-roasted boar, its skin blistered golden and its tusks polished like trophies. Everyone tears into hunks with their hands, no dainty forks, no fuss, just raw appetite matched to roaring laughter. The Celts loved their meat heavy and hearty. Archaeological digs show that cattle, pigs, and sheep were mainstays, but pigs, especially wild boar, had special symbolic weight. You bite into a strip of fat-rimmed pork, smoky and faintly sweet from honey glaze. Yes, honey, because when you have a thriving network of beekeeping and wild hives, sugar hasn't even been invented yet. Honey sweetened not only meat but also that bubbling jug of mead someone keeps refilling in your cup. You can't keep track of who owns the jug. It's communal, passed along like gossip. Across the hall, bronze cauldrons simmer with thick stews. Imagine a medieval slow cooker but without the electric plug. Just a hulking iron pot suspended above embers, loaded with venison, onions, herbs like mugwort and fennel, and maybe some barley to thicken it. You scoop a ladleful into a wooden bowl and sip. It's earthy, peppery, almost medicinal. Historians still argue whether the Celts leaned more toward fresh herbs tossed in last minute or dried blends for winter storage, but either way the result feels rustic and nourishing. And then there's dairy. You spot clay vessels holding curds and soft cheeses, tangy and crumbly, perfect against smoky meat. Butter too, churned thick, smeared on rounds of oatcakes pulled hot from stone slabs. If you've ever eaten a Scottish oatcake, you're tasting direct descendants of these ancient kitchens. The nutty crunch balances all that dripping grease, saving your fingers from slipping right off the boar bone. Meanwhile, Vikings aren't far behind in flavor intensity. Jump forward a sea voyage and you're inside a longhouse somewhere along a fjord. The place reeks gloriously of salt fish, stockfish in fact. Cod, dried stiff as a paddle and later soaked or stewed, kept Norse sailors alive across frigid oceans. You chew on one piece that's so salty you swear it puckers your ears. Joking aside, this stuff powered raids and explorations. Basically Viking energy bars except less convenient to carry in a gym bag. But Viking feasts were more than dried cod. On celebratory nights, they roasted lamb or beef, sometimes horse meat. Yes, you heard that right, and no, you probably won't find it at IKEA's cafeteria anymore. They brewed ale strong enough to drop a walrus, plus honey mead just like the Celts, with horns raised high while skalds chanted sagas. If you're wondering whether anyone spilled mead onto their wool tunics and reeked for weeks, the answer is absolutely yes. Longhouse ventilation was not exactly open concept. A quirky tidbit: Norse cooks sometimes buried food in the ground for fermentation. Fish heads and livers could be left to rot just enough to soften, then consumed as delicacies. Your modern stomach might revolt, but to them, it was a prized way of preserving protein. Historians still argue whether this practice was common fare or mostly ceremonial, but either way you'd better keep your nose plugged. So here you are, half your night in Celtic timber halls, the other in Viking longhouses. The laughter is loud, the food primal, the drinks flowing, and the fire warming your cheeks. You lean back on a wooden bench, belly stuffed with boar, fish, and bread, and you realize, in these cultures food wasn't just sustenance. It was identity, it was myth, it was proof you belonged to the tribe. You're sitting cross-legged on a carpet spread across endless sand, the night air cool but dry, the stars brighter than any streetlight you've ever known. A leather bag is passed to you, and when you tilt it back, the taste is sharp, sour, and faintly fizzy. Fermented mare's milk, the beloved drink of nomads from the Central Asian steppe. The locals call it kumis, and you cough slightly as bubbles sting your throat. Everyone around you laughs at your reaction because yes, you just failed the nomad initiation test. Still, you take another sip because hydration here is serious business, even if it tastes like carbonated yogurt gone rogue. Nomadic diets always bend to mobility. You can't haul orchards or wheat fields on horseback, but you can carry herds. Sheep, goats, camels, and horses define your pantry. Tonight, skewers of lamb roast slowly over coals, fat dripping and sparking as it hits embers. You bite into a cube, smoky on the outside, juicy within, seasoned simply with salt and wild herbs. The flavor feels clean, like the meat is announcing its origins without apology. Dairy follows everything, thick yogurt scooped with flatbread, dried cheese balls called kurut that crunch like savory jawbreakers, and butter churned until it resembles dense clay. Nomads didn't mess around with presentation. They valued food that survived long treks and brutal climates. Out here in the desert, a Bedouin host hands you a small cup of bitter coffee, flavored with cardamom. The heat of the liquid contrasts against the cool night wind. Dates accompany it, sticky and sweet like nature's candy bars. Remember, without refrigerators, sugar came from fruit or honey, so a handful of dates could fuel hours of travel. You chew slowly, and suddenly that earlier fermented mare's milk feels less shocking. Bedouin tradition also prized goat's milk, which could be drunk fresh, churned into butter, or soured into laban, a tangy yogurt drink that cools your throat when the sun blazes. Historians still argue whether camel meat was staple fare or more ceremonial. Some accounts suggest nomads avoided butchering camels unless times grew dire, since those animals doubled as transport and pack carriers. Others insist camel roasts marked major gatherings like weddings or tribal alliances. Tonight, you notice a giant pot simmering behind the tents, and you wonder if the stew within might be camel. A local just winks at you cryptically. Apparently the debate hasn't ended even here. Quirky detail? Mongol warriors allegedly carried dried meat under their saddles. The constant pounding of the horse's gallop tenderized the meat until it was edible on the go. Whether that's fact or exaggerated lore, you glance at your lap and picture a steak marinating beneath your thighs, not exactly appetizing but undeniably efficient. Modern meal prep, step style. The horizon shifts in your imagination, and suddenly you're riding alongside a caravan. Spice-laden camels sway ahead of you, their loads perfumed with cinnamon, nutmeg, and saffron bound for markets far away. Nomads weren't isolated eaters, they were movers of flavors. Through them, ingredients crossed deserts and steppes, stitched into the diets of empires you've already visited. That sprinkle of black pepper on your Celtic boar? It traveled thanks to traders like these. As dawn creeps pink across the sky, you tear a piece of flatbread baked against hot stones, still warm, still smoky, and smear it with salty butter. You sip more kumis, not because you love it but because you're determined not to gag this time, and you realize that for nomads food was never just about taste. It was about survival in landscapes that dared you to adapt or perish. Everything here, from the leathery cheese balls to the sour milk, is proof that humans can make cuisine out of hardship. You wipe your mouth, glance at the infinite horizon, and feel both very small and oddly full. Your boots squelch through a muddy medieval village street, and the first thing you notice isn't the church bell or the chickens darting underfoot, it's the smell of bread. You follow your nose into a thatched hut, where a peasant family huddles around a rough wooden table. Their plates aren't plates at all but thick slabs of coarse bread called trenchers. You pick one up, hard and stale on the bottom, soft only on top, perfect for soaking broth. Soup ladled into it drips slowly until the crust goes soggy. Eventually you eat both the meal and the plate. Talk about eco-friendly tableware? Take that, paper straws. The peasant diet leans heavy on grains because wheat, barley, oats, and rye were cheaper than meat. Gruel and pottage fill most days, a bubbling stew of grains, leeks, maybe beans if luck allows. It's not glamorous but it sticks to your ribs and keeps you tilling fields. On special days you might get eggs, cheese, or a scrap of pork fat used more as flavoring than a meal. Imagine dicing bacon so tiny it resembles glitter, then sprinkling it into cabbage stew, because that's all you could afford. You chew, and while the taste is mild, you can't deny it's warm and comforting, like edible central heating. Move up the social ladder though, and the scene changes fast. Step through castle gates into a great hall, and suddenly the table groans with roasted swan, whole deer, and pies stuffed with spiced meats. A servant plops down a dish of peacock, feathers reattached after roasting just for show. You blink, trying not to laugh, because really, who redresses a bird after cooking it? But for nobles, extravagance was the point. The more outlandish the display, the more prestige you earned. Between bites of venison, nobles washed down food with wine, spiced with cinnamon or cloves shipped at great expense. For peasants, ale is the drink of choice, weak enough to hydrate without knocking you out. Children drink it too because water sources often double as sewers. Yes, you heard that right. You probably wouldn't survive this without medieval ale as your hydration plan. Historians still argue whether nobles actually enjoyed the heavily spiced food or just flaunted their access to costly imports. After all, pepper and ginger could cost more than gold. Some scholars think the spice craze masked meat that wasn't exactly fresh, while others argue it was pure fashion. Either way you taste it, a pheasant drenched in nutmeg and saffron, and your tongue buzzes like it's been dunked in a candle shop. Quirky fact: in some noble feasts, pies were baked with live birds hidden inside. When the crust cracked open, the birds would burst out, flapping around the hall as everyone gasped. Entertainment and food in one. You glance nervously at your trencher, half expecting a pigeon to pop out, but thankfully it's just mutton stew tonight. Meanwhile, peasants nibble onions, garlic, and turnips, cheap crops that flavor pottages day after day. Bread here isn't the fluffy white loaf you know. It's dense, dark, and gritty, often laced with bran or ground beans to stretch supplies. Your teeth crunch on what feels suspiciously like sand. Turns out, millstones sometimes shed grit into the flour, so medieval dental care wasn't exactly helped by the diet. Smile, and half your teeth are already plotting their exit strategy. The contrast between noble and peasant plates feels stark. You're reminded that food is hierarchy in edible form. Down below, survival gruel; up above, culinary theater with gilded goblets. And yet, despite the gulf, both classes gather around bread, broth, and ale. Whether humble or extravagant, meals anchor communities, feed labor, fuel wars, and sustain faith. You lick the last of the broth from your trencher, while across the castle, a noble tears another leg of venison. Different worlds, same hunger. You lean back, belly full of venison in the hall and broth-soaked bread in the cottage, and for a moment the centuries fold into one another. You realize the flavors you've been tasting aren't gone, they echo in the kitchens you know today. That chewy oatcake from the Celtic fireside? It lives on in Scottish biscuits stacked in grocery aisles. The Viking stockfish, salty enough to shrivel your lips, still hangs in Norwegian smokehouses, and if you've ever tried bacalao in Spain or brandade in France, you've been tasting its descendants without even realizing. A slice of sourdough crosses your memory, the tangy chew that hipster bakeries obsess over. That's medieval fermentation talking. Peasants with bubbling cauldrons of pottage and bowls of starter dough keeping yeast alive before anyone had a clue about microbes. Your kombucha bottle with its floating blob like a jellyfish on holiday? Steppe nomads nod in approval. They've been fermenting milk into kumis long before mason jars and Pinterest boards made fermentation trendy. Historians still argue whether modern spice habits truly descend from medieval fashion or whether global trade rewired taste entirely. Either way, your pumpkin-spiced latte owes a little something to nobles tossing saffron into pheasant stews just to show off. And that plate of barbecue ribs? Straight line back to feasts around fires where Celts gnawed boar bones, grease on their fingers. Funny how history licks your plate clean and serves it back to you in a new form. Here's a quirky one. Ketchup, the king of modern condiments, may trace back to fermented fish sauces that Romans loved and Chinese traders carried centuries ago. Imagine slathering garum over your fries. Disgusting, or maybe delicious. You'll never know unless you travel far enough back to risk it. But it proves a point. Even your squeeze bottle has ancient whispers inside. Look at your table now. Bread basket? Old as civilization. Cheese board? Practically Stone Age. Beer bottle sweating on the counter? Brewed in Mesopotamia long before football season claimed it. And the act of gathering, clinking glasses, splitting dishes, telling stories, that's been the same since the first campfire. So as you scrape the last spoon of ice cream from a pint or nibble midnight cereal, you're repeating patterns carved into human memory. Food is history disguised as habit. Bite by bite, you're chewing the past, savoring not just taste but the whole messy, inventive story of survival. And now, with your journey complete, let the noise of feasts and markets fade. You set aside the trenchers, the horns of mead, the bowls of pottage, and you notice how quiet the room around you has become. The fires have dimmed, the tables cleared, and only a faint aroma of smoke and spice seems to linger in the air. You breathe slowly, and with each breath, the centuries slip further away. Picture the long roads of history folding into soft paths beneath your feet, where every step is cushioned by breadcrumbs and hushed laughter from meals long past. The voices that once roared across halls and deserts grow faint, until they sound more like a lullaby than a battle cry. Even the clang of cauldrons and the clink of goblets smooth themselves into gentle echoes, like waves brushing a distant shore. You stretch, not with hunger but with contentment, and imagine laying your head beside a quiet fire. Above you, stars drift across an endless sky, the same ones that nomads, peasants, and nobles once tilted their gaze toward. Their tables are gone, but their tastes remain, woven into yours, proof that time may change the menu but never the need for comfort, for warmth, for a meal shared. Let your eyelids sink, heavy as millstones though much kinder. Let your breath lengthen, as steady as the simmer of a pottage pot. And as you drift, remember that you carry those flavors within you, boar and barley, honey and bread, echoes of ancient kitchens, softened into dreams. Sleep well, traveler. You've eaten your way through history. Tomorrow the table will be yours again.